Sid, perhaps you could talk to us about your initial research experiences in Puerto Rico and worker in the cane, and how you came to develop the perspective you did on the worker in the cane and the way you treated him.
Good. Let me begin then, Dale, by talking a little bit about how I ended up in Puerto Rico. Simply by way of background for listeners, Julian Stewart came to Columbia University in 1947, if memory serves, and he had in mind, early after he came, a real shift in his own research interests. He'd been for years at the Bureau of American Ethnology and had been making studies of Native American peoples in North America. And then he had edited the Handbook on South American Indians for several years. And coming to Columbia was, in fact, his first academic job, his first university job after many years at the BAE. And he had a conception about what anthropology could do and where it could do it that really was quite radical for its time. He selected among the students at Columbia a group of young people, of young, as it happens, young males. Most of the graduate students at Columbia at that time in anthropology were males, and most of them were veterans. He selected a group of students on the basis of their qualifying exam in anthropology, which seemed to me like a really terrible basis for the selection, but it turned out all right because they were all competent people. And we were then asked by him to take a course which would prepare us for our fieldwork in a complex society. The course really didn't do that very well. We heard lectures by Frank Tannenbaum and Morris Siegel, an anthropologist who had spent time teaching at the University of Puerto Rico and had carried out a community study there, and several others. And we read a number of monographs. And I remember this event, this period that we spent together, because we got to know each other. It was Robert Manners and Ray Sheely and Eric Wolf and myself, and actually Stanley Diamond, who had intended to be one of the field workers. And what I recall most vividly is our reading a monograph about which I'd never heard a word. I didn't know anything about it. It was by a young Chinese ethnographer at the time named Fei Xiaotung. And Fei had done a book called Peasant Life in China. It was his first book. It was a community study in China. And what riveted my attention at the time that I read it was the people in that village. It was a Chinese village. I knew nothing about Chinese culture. It was a Chinese village in which many of the young women worked essentially in a factory producing silk. And silk was for the world market. And so among the books we read, there were others which I'll mention. Among the books we read, there was this one which showed a direct connection between a tiny little Chinese village and the world outside. I remember being quite impressed and thinking that an anthropologist had done this and that his teacher had been Bronislaw Malinowski, who wrote the introduction to the book. Well, I was really arrested by that discovery. This semester of fieldwork was intended to familiarize us with each other and to prepare us for fieldwork, and in fact it did that very poorly. None of us was truly prepared for fieldwork, and I spoke no Spanish, neither did Eric. He was the fellow field worker I got to know best. And so we went to the field, and we're instructed by Stewart to select the communities in which we worked. But these communities should represent major lifeways or major threads in the economy of Puerto Rico. And he had this theoretical notion that when he took the data from our communities and put it together, he would then understand what he called the cross-cutting institutions that tied these communities together into a society. And it was all in his head, and that's pretty much where it remained, because no cross-cutting ties ever turned out to explain anything. I chose to work in a sugar community, and I made that choice somewhat masochistically. I thought it was going to be very difficult, and because it would represent American power at its baldest, its most obvious, that people there would be very difficult to work with. It turned out to be entire nonsense. It's not at all the case. People there were very warm and friendly once they got to know me, and there was no difficulty at all in doing fieldwork. But when I got there and settled down, I realized that everybody in the community in which I was working worked in sugarcane. There was hardly any exception. There were one or two prostitutes. There were a few people who had little stores, tiny little ventorillos, they called them, tiny little places where they sold food and a few other things. And one or two drivers of cars who were chauffeurs, as they call them, choferes, whose job it was to take people back and forth to the town. And that's about it. Everybody else worked in sugarcane. And it was inevitable that I would begin to learn about the sugarcane work. And I had this unbelievable good luck in falling into the hands of a sugarcane worker there to whom I had been introduced by the town mayor. And it turned out that this man was a lieutenant of the particular political party to which the mayor belonged, which is the Popular Party, Partido Popular. And this local fellow, whom I got to know, impressed me immediately by his high intelligence and his remarkable personality. We became good friends in that year and a half I was there. And I was to return at a later time to write down his life story. I won't go into much detail about that because the book was published. It's been out for 50 years now, exactly 50 years this year, and it's easily obtained so people can read about this man. But it was, I think, unavoidable that I would become very conscious of the work these people did in the cane, of its remarkable difficulty, of the care and intelligence needed to do it effectively, of the enormous physical effort it demanded of people who were actually poorly nourished and poorly cared for medically. So that I saw, in a way, with my own eyes, so much of what both my parents had told me about their lives as younger people. And I had never had to do anything that difficult or dangerous or demanding in my life up to that time. So that I was deeply impressed by it and interested in it. And one of the things that came out of that period of work with Tasso and his fellow workers that struck me very forcibly was how their striving for excellence at what they did was one of the ways in which the economic system under which they labored could most exploit them. That caring about work, this whole notion of workmanship and craft that people can hold so dearly when they work with their hands for a living, is one of the ways that the system for which they work can exploit them and betray them. And that stuck with me forcibly, really, I think, for the whole of my history in relation to research in the Caribbean region. The other thing that I think has to be said about that work, and plainly reverts back to what I said about the monograph by Fay, working in that community, I came to understand that you could hardly define it as community without reference to the sugar industry, because it would be fair to say that the sugar industry had produced the community, that it was a product of a particular economic system reaching into a society and finding within it what it needed in order to get the product it desired. And that also was a very an understanding and insight that was forced on me by local circumstances in which I grew to understand and had not understood before. Let me then advance this a little bit by talking about my field director, John Moore, because of something that he taught me on the basis of my understanding of that village of Jauca. Robert Redfield, who had been Moore's colleague at Chicago and who was a very eminent anthropologist, who had done most of his field work, such as it was, in Yucatan, and who had done studies there in order to test ideas he had about how the world changed. He had organized a study that involved 4 communities that he saw as along a continuum running from a tiny tribal village to a large modern city. And he thought that if you looked at the processes that connected these 4 communities together, you saw secularization, or disorganization coming from organization. He had a number of ideas about what happened if you looked at those 4 communities. And when I began to report to Moore on what I was learning in Jauca about the sugar industry and about how people lived and what that community was, as I began to talk about that, Moore said to me, you know, we could replicate Redfield's study here in Puerto Rico and have it come out just the way Redfield's study did. And he said, all we'd have to do is ignore the sugar industry. We would pick 4 communities that went from a tiny village in the countryside right up to San Juan, and we'd have secularization, modernization, disorganization, it would all be there. But of course, if we did that, we would leave out the sugar industry. And of course, what Moore was pointing out to me was Redfield had done this study of Yucatan, and he'd carefully left out the haciendas that produced henequen, so that he'd left out the most important economic activity in the place in order to do a study of modernization and so on. Well, there was, I think, a blinding insight, and I wrote up my understanding of the community I was in. It was published actually in a sociological journal, in order to make the point. And Redfield, when he read this, wrote me, unsolicited, wrote me and said how much he enjoyed the article. He was a really wonderfully gentlemanly and good person. And I learned a lot from Redfield, even though I thought that what he was finding out was totally irrelevant to the modern world. Anyway, this by way of raising the subject of what it was I learned in that place in my first year and a half there. After I left the community, I discovered that Tasso, unbeknownst to me, had joined a Pentecostal church. It came as a great surprise, and I went back there the year following to ask him if he'd be willing to work with me on his life history. And he agreed warmly to do that. And I came back and wrote the book that eventually came out. And that was an interesting experience for me too, because I wanted to find out about his conversion experience, and he wanted to show me that to do that I had first to contextualize his life. And as I say somewhere in print, he was a better sociologist at that moment than I was, or than I was trying to be.
Lord, what a night, not a bite, what a Saturday night. Oh, Lord, what a night, not a bite, what a Saturday night. Oh, Lord.
How did you then decide to become a Caribbeanist?
When I was doing my fieldwork in Puerto Rico, I had not yet come to that decision. And it's interesting to me and curious that none of my colleagues, none of the people I worked with at the time in Puerto Rico decided to do that. I was the only one. For one thing, I began to read, of course, and while I was doing fieldwork, I was also reading and learning more about the Caribbean, something that the course that Julian had run for us, it didn't really motivate us to do. I think I was not the only one who had failed to take advantage of that opportunity. But in the field, I began to read about the Caribbean. And I read Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, which made a tremendous impression on me, and a number of other Puerto Rican things that impressed me too about the history of the island. I was struck by some of the differences in the community because people had names for the categories of settlement. So they talked about agregados who lived on the plantation land. And they talked about the people on the land along the roads where where they lived had been legitimized by the popular government, independizados. And so there were these categories that carried with them the idea of how people came to that position. Agregados were, in a certain sense, very dependent upon the plantation. And if someone engaged in union activity, they'd simply throw him out of his house. So there were these kinds of differences that I began to recognize. But I think I decided to be a Caribbeanist when it really was borne in upon me how many European countries had tried to feed at that particular trough. We all know about the Dutch, the British, the French, the Spaniards, and eventually the Americans. Those are all familiar. But there were these remarkable cases. At one point, one island was given to the Knights of Malta. It was based on their experience with sugar in the Crusades. The Northern European leagues, like the Hansa, were very interested in the Caribbean. There was something called the Duchy of Courland that was very interested in Trinidad and Tobago. So there were these remarkable histories having to, and of course the question rises up immediately, why would Europe have been so interested in this tiny little tropical place? And so that really awakened my interest still more. When I came back to the United States and I was writing my thesis, which was essentially on a sugarcane plantation, or as I said, a sugarcane plantation community, I tried to find things to read, and I did find some that were very enlightening indeed. Edgar Thompson and H.J. Niebuhr and a number of other things of that sort. But I asked my teacher what he had read on the plantation that he would direct me to. He had nothing. He had read nothing on it. And I was struck both by my ignorance and by his in this regard, because on reflection, this institution that the Europeans imposed upon Caribbean peoples beginning as early as 1510, sent sugar to Spain in 1516. This institution which they imposed upon Caribbean peoples, together with slavery, of course, and together with capital for machinery and all the rest, was a first overseas undertaking by the Europeans to produce food abroad for their own consumption. So it was something new in the world, and it had planetary significance. It was the first time that empires were ever established across the oceans. So it was an important moment, and I, much later in my career, I fully understood this and called attention to it. But at the time, it did have the effect on me of wanting to know how rural life had turned out in the British Islands and the French Islands and the Dutch Islands and so on. And so partly it was that nobody could tell me anything, and partly that I saw the comparative dimension of this as being exciting, that I got interested in the Caribbean region. I decided to work next in Jamaica. It was due to various circumstances, including, among others, that I had some funds available to me, made available to me to do that work. And I went to Jamaica with a kind of central thought, which again touches on plantations, slavery, and all the rest. At the end of slavery in Jamaica and the other British possessions, a large number of free people were settled on plantations that had gone out of business, on bankrupt plantations, by religious missionary groups. And so these people who settle in these communities, who are parishioners of the particular churches who had helped them, were people who could apply the agricultural knowledge they had learned while still slaves to land that they now owned, that they bought by themselves individually and now own within church communities. And I wanted to know more about that process. And so I went there with the intention of settling such a village, Sturgetown in this case, named after Joseph Sturge, the great British abolitionist. And that was where I did my fieldwork, in that next piece of Caribbean fieldwork. what I wanted to learn there was how people who had lived as slaves could have become effective farmers, peasant farmers, on land that they now owned in small plots. And it was through this that I first came to the idea, on the one hand, that as slaves, these people were proto-peasants, peasants in being, peasants in becoming. And the other idea that Caribbean peasantries altogether had to have come out of a state of enslavement. That what was peasantry in the Caribbean had nothing to do historically at all with what was peasantry in Europe. That these were, if you will, post-industrial peasantries, because they had gone through the plantation period before becoming full-fledged peasants. And as full-fledged peasants were still very different from European peasants. I remember once giving a ride to a Burmese a scholar who had come to the United States to give some lecture, very interesting Burmese economist. And I said to him, it's interesting to me that students of underdeveloped economies in economics are frequently from peasant countries. And he said, whom do you have in mind? I said, well, W. Arthur Lewis, for instance, and yourself. And he said, well, I come from a real peasant country. And I thought that, I should have followed it up, but I didn't have the nerve. But I thought that was an interesting remark, that he would not think of the people of the Caribbean as real peasants. But I think what he meant was they're a different kind of peasants, which they are. So that Jamaican work was, on my part, an intention lived out to see how things worked out in a different imperial tradition and what it meant to have been a slave and become a free man. And in local sociological terms. And that was, again, very different from the Caribbean experience. These people in Jamaica had extended kinship of a kind, not really in the rural proletarian areas of Puerto Rico. They had conceptions of themselves that were quite different. And of course, very striking is that Jamaica, its population almost entirely is non-white, whereas in Puerto Rico, the population that's not white is in minority. Now, of course, what we mean by white, non-white is open to question, but almost anyone, I think, not knowing the histories of those two places would certainly conclude on the basis of visits that their population had very different histories. So that experience for me was interesting in this regard. And as far as labor is concerned, you saw labor in these peasant communities of Jamaica of a very different sort from what I was used to in Puerto Rico. You didn't see these large, well-organized fields being worked by machines and men together. You didn't see the loading of sugarcane on trucks. All that was absent. Really in a peasant society in some important ways. And even sugar itself, which was manufactured in Jamaica in the raw state, just as it was in Puerto Rico in some areas, was also available in local markets in really logs, as they called them, which were simply large blocks of sugar, muscovado sugar, that was produced with oxen on small holdings. So the Jamaican experience, in some ways for me, was stepping back in history to see something that I hadn't seen before. And the work that I did there, though brief, was in this way, I think, useful to me. It extended my sense of what the Caribbean was like, and it led me to see how much more complex its labor history had been than one would have supposed.
I think that one of the outcomes of that experience is the way you've treated slavery, with the idea of proto-peasantry and then a reconstituted peasantry, and in a different context. I think that's been a very useful thing for many people, because it's let us understand slavery in a more dynamic and historical way, and not as a kind of static category. And that's made, I think, a big difference, and I think the way you use the categories is very distinctive and helpful.
The thing that I find so striking, and I wrote a paper in a festschrift for Julian Stewart on this, on currency in Jamaica in the pre-emancipation era, when the markets flourished across Jamaica. And those markets were entirely people with slaves. The people who sold and the people who bought. Mostly the people who bought. All of the people who bought, really, were slaves. And most of the people who sold were slaves as well. And this is before emancipation. And there are features to it that are quite striking. The fact that people were not allowed to sell meat in most cases because they were afraid that slaves would butcher animals and carry them to market and sell them. The animals belonged to the plantation. The fact that even though slaves were not freely permitted to wander where they wished, they had to have permits in order to travel any distance, exceptions were made if they were going to market. In no time at all, the population of Jamaica that was free came to depend on slave production of their food, even though the slaves were not supposed to be engaged in food production. So the contradictions that arose in the proto-peasant era between slaves as slaves and slaves as men became crystallized by slave production. And their currency, at one point, I don't remember the figure, but at one point, something like 30% or 40% of the silver currency in Jamaica was in the hands of slaves. So you get these living contradictions where the masters said one thing about what the slaves were capable of and knew they were lying as they said it. And the slaves were obviously capable of much more than they were supposed to be or they were allowed to be. Those kinds of everyday issues that come out when you begin to look at how men work are often concealed by categories. And as we know, Marx himself, when he looked at the Caribbean, had no idea at all what everyday life for slaves was like, neither its worst horrors nor its unknown features. I think that, again, trying to get people to find out the humble, ordinary, everyday details of drudgery so that they understand better the skills that drudgery brings to people and requires of them is something anthropologists need to do if they want to understand how economic forces shape humanity, how they shape human experience. And if they're left out, then what we have to say about things such as power hang in the air with no foundation.
Vite oublier ça, c'est trop grand la peine, car depuis jour-là devient moins le jeu. Vite oublier ça, c'est trop grand la peine, devient moins le jeu.
I wonder if I might turn to my third field experience at this point. It was only after those 7 years that I was able to do some real field work, more substantial in character than what I had done in Jamaica. I was very fortunate. I applied for fellowships and I was given fellowships that supported 2 years of work, and my colleagues at Yale allowed me to take 2 consecutive years off, which is really unprecedented. So I was very fortunate. I went to Haiti for my third field experience, and here we had a French colonial background rather than British or Spanish, as in these other 2 cases, and there I decided to study markets. I'd found markets interesting in Jamaica, but in Haiti they were a much more important feature of the landscape, and I was interested in them among other things because there were, it seemed to me, no important national institutions in Haiti, that Haiti had been born a state at the end of slavery in 1804, at the end of the revolution, but that it was a state with very little in the way of local institutions. And the markets in the 1950s when I first went there, seemed like one of the most important ways in which Haiti was knitted together as a society. And I wanted to study the market women, which is what I did. I couldn't, in this case, do a community study unless I simply studied the community and studied the market women in it, such as they were. I wanted to study the markets themselves. And so that's what I undertook to do. Once again, I think work came out as important because there were so many different categories of market woman with different names and different goods. And their specialties, people who dealt in eggs, for instance, or in perishable vegetables like tomatoes. And I spent a year and a half there and got a new sense of rural life because Haiti had had a much longer time than, say, Jamaica to create a post-emancipation kind of society. But one, as I said, peculiarly bereft of institutions. If one looks at schools or healthcare or communication or any other aspect of the infrastructure, such as roads, Haiti is totally exceptional. Africa, if we can talk of the benefits of colonialism at all, Africa had benefited from European application to build roads and schools and all that stuff, and of course it was always done on the backs of the people, but it was done in some cases. Whereas in Haiti there was none of that. Everything before had existed only for free people, and most of it was gone after 13 years of revolution. So that it was a society that began like a collection of communities rather than a society. And it had great difficulty building institutions, and still does. That's been characteristic of Haiti's freedom. The work that I did there, again, took different form because of the problem I'd chosen to work on, and I can enlarge on that if you wish, but I'm not sure it's directly relevant to what you wanted to talk about.
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. One of the things that I realized about the Haitian peasantry was that the market system served purposes there that other institutions might serve in a different country. One could, by selling some part of one's surplus to the market, get funds that could then be used for further investment in agriculture. When you sold a product to the market that you would yourself eventually need, you were gambling that the price of that commodity would go down when you needed to buy it back. If the price went up, then you were in effect losing money by buying it back. So that these kinds of manipulations that made the market a bank-like institution. The second thing was that in Haiti, more clearly than in Jamaica even, and certainly very differently from Puerto Rico, gender relationships in economics were very different because in Haiti, men and women, though married, have no investment, and I use the word in both an emotional and in an economic sense, in the work of the other. Men never try to tap into their wives' capital, and women do not expect their husbands to invest in their business. So that a lot of the economic endeavor in Haiti is born on the backs of women, and it takes the form not of manual labor in the fields, but of manual labor marketing. And I had some women marketer friends whose lives I describe in that most recent book that show something about what they have to endure in order to be successful market women. Their terminology is interesting because all of the words we learn in our first class in economics, like arbitrage and opportunity cost and marginal utility, and all of these terms that we need in order to talk like economists, Haitian women know. They have their own words for these things, of course. But the simplest distinction to mention is they talk about l'argent, which is money, l'argent in French, and mama l'argent. Mama l'argent is capital. L'argent is currency. And the things they do in order to defend their interests and to ensure their futures economically are fascinating because in a way it reads like an economics textbook. I mentioned one illustration. I asked this favorite market woman, friend of mine, about selling. All of the women who sell red beans sit in a line in the market. They do that, they say, so that other people can find them. They know where the red beans will be found. But if you go to the market early and you watch these women sell, you discover something right away. If you say to a market woman, how do you know at what price to sell? She says, I don't know at what price to sell. I only know at what price I bought. She's indicating something about her investment. She learns at what price to sell by sitting in a row with other women selling the same commodity. And early in the morning, buyers, would-be buyers, will do what they call marchandage, comparison shopping. They go down the line asking price. And if all of the women ask too high a price, as is likely since the women already know at what price they're going to sell, that doesn't mean the price at which they're selling, but the price at which they're going to sell. And if no one buys, when that same lady comes back an hour later, she will find that the price has gone down slightly, unless someone else has already bought. The price is set by the buyers, not by the sellers. And after the buyers have set the price for the sellers, all of the sellers sell at the same price. So you see this thing working, and you watch it, and it's, like Adam Smith tells us, you see this thing working, and then as they sell, you discover, first of all, if you're close to them and know them, that they have favorite buyers who don't buy at the market price but at a lower price, or who buy at that price but get a larger quantity. You discover that that's going on at the same time that they say there's a price at which they sell. And you also discover how they deal with their own competitors. I say to this lady, okay, so you're all selling at 15 centimes a marmite, and someone comes along who is willing to sell at a lower price. What do you do? And her answer, I think, is so beautiful. She says, I have to ask you a question. I say, what's that? How much has she got? And I say, well, she's got just a little bit. We let her sell. What if she got a lot? We buy her out. So you can see how the market is constructed and how these women all know what they need to know and have terminology for it. They don't need anyone to tell them about opportunity costs. They know about it. So watching how many of these women are illiterate, but they can add and subtract. And watching them do things of this kind, I think it was just a wonderful experience. I got good enough at it so that occasionally when a lady wanted to go pee, I could sit and sell for her while she went and came back. And I was good enough to do that. And the one picture of me in the market, and I don't know if you've ever seen this picture, I'm walking through some mud, is interesting most of all because nobody is paying any attention to me. Not a single one of these women is turning around to look at me. Well, I'm in a market of 5,000 women, they're all black and nobody looks at me. I think that's proof that I really was successful there. So that was, for me, the most demanding and in some ways the most exciting field work. At that point I'd gotten more interested in economic development and I enjoyed the work and took pride in it. But that was my last field work, really, except for some stuff in Hong Kong. That was my last field work. It was the third case. And it was, I think, in its way, the most, not deviant, but it was least like the rest of my field work. It was the most, for me, the most unusual.
Well, in a certain, if I think about the three cases, one of the things, in the difference between, particularly, let's say, post-emancipation, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Haiti, it seems to me so much of the work on the Caribbean and elsewhere works with this slavery-freedom dichotomy. In each of your cases, in different ways, problematizes what freedom meant. In two of the cases, clearly the persistence of the plantation is one of the mitigating factors, and perhaps in Haiti, the absence of the plantation And maybe you could discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's so dramatic because when the Americans occupied the country in 1915, and they hung around for 25 years, just almost 25 years, one of the things they did was they started a sugar company, of course, and it was called Hasco, the Haitian American Sugar Company, and they produced sugar right outside Port-au-Prince, a small quantity of sugar. But much more interesting than this undertaking or other undertakings of the Americans, some of which were very beneficial. I mean, they didn't only do bad things, they did some good things. One of the more interesting features was what was said by the Americans while they were there. I think, again, the dates, 1915, 1937. A few things continued another 3 years. They kept the customs house receipts. The Americans took them for another, I think, 3 years. But what people said that were so revealing to me, so demystifying. One of the people sent there had the job, he was an economic advisor to the United States government and to the regime they put in place, and he was supposed to help them figure out how to make Haiti prosper. And he said, and I think I quote him, I don't know if I quote him in this latest book, but I've written stuff from which I've cited him, because he said the difficulty with developing Haiti, the problem with its economic development is that people don't want anything. He said that the only way we can develop Haiti is to get people to want things, and once they want things, then it will develop. Well, if they don't want anything, why do they want to make them want things? I thought that was so marvelous. And he had an assistant, and the assistant was a, I'm sorry, I'm blocking on the name, but it'll float up into my brain in about 2 seconds. McAfee? The family that produces Tabasco sauce.
McElhinney.
McElhinney, thank you. McElhinney. He was a McElhinney. And he sat during one meeting silently alongside his boss, talking about, silently, listening to discussion of economics. And at the end of the meeting, and we have this in writing, at the end of the meeting, his boss said to him, "How come you didn't say anything?" And he said, "Because I was looking across the table at the economics minister and thinking to myself how much they would have gotten for him in New Orleans if he was being sold." Mm-hmm. That was how the assistant to the economics advisor was learning from his experience in Haiti. So you have this picture of an American, powerful American government and army taking over this tiny little country and running it and doing a lot of bad things and some good things, staffed by people with those kinds of mentalities. Mm-hmm. And Haiti, after all, had won its independence and kept its independence from then on and was not invaded until 1915. So it's so remarkable. I mean, there, it seemed to me, more than in the case of Jamaica, more even than the case of Puerto Rico, there you see before your eyes the Caribbean as it had been, mm-hmm. and the people who'd made it that way confronting each other 200 years later. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Those remarks, I think, are so telling. And of course, we still get them. They haven't come to an end. Mm-hmm. So slavery in these three cases, it was relatively minor. Some people will complain at this, but it was relatively minor in Puerto Rico. I think that's fair to say. The slave population in Puerto Rico never got over 13%. And slavery only became important around after 1815, and it was gone in 1873. So it really didn't matter a hell of a lot. You're talking about Jamaica, you're talking about Haiti, you're talking about an institution that really defined the society. So the Puerto Rican case is, in this sense, a little off the charts. Mm-hmm. But in the case of Haiti, the revolution ended in 1804, and any person with his wits about him would have known then that its future was marked. After the Haiti experience. Everybody should have known, and they didn't. But they wanted to retain it, they can keep it. And so Haiti remained then a thorn in their side for the next century. And it was a living rebuke. And I've tried to talk about that at length, that the reason that Haiti's history has been so perfectly papered over in the West is because they don't want to be reminded. And the proof that they still don't want to be reminded is we have celebrations, all kinds of celebrations in this country where slavery isn't mentioned, as if it had nothing to do with our past. So that I think Haiti illustrates very well. That's by the by, but that was part of my learning there. People, when they want to say something is very old, they say depuis Guinée, since Guinea. In other words, that's a way of remembering Africa. But of course they remember Africa and their religion and their daily lives in a lot of ways. And in Jamaica also, but much less so. And in Puerto Rico, hardly at all. Of course, people in Puerto Rico, many people in Puerto Rico make a point of denying that it ever had any significance at all. And luckily we have people working there now who bring its consciousness back all of the time.
Lai le lo lai le lo lai lo lai lo le lo lai lai le lo lai lo lai ah.
When we think of the Caribbean, it's a region where the legacy of slavery is clearly preponderant in defining the nature of Caribbean societies and experience. But at one point you said to me that for much of your life you thought the analytically defining axis of the Caribbean was the black-white axis, and now you think it's the Hispanic, non-Hispanic axis. And I'd like to know how you think about that now.
Yeah. Well, the reason, before I tell you what changed my mind, let me make the following general point. When the Spaniards, Columbus, discovered the New World, and when the Caribbean region first began to be colonized, 1493, the second voyage, from that period until the 1620s, until nearly 1630, Spain was unchallenged territorially in the Caribbean. There were people that came and sold slaves, and there were boats that smuggled this and that. So there was a good deal of trade, most of it secret or hidden or illegitimate, illegal from the point of view of the Spaniards. But for the first 125 years, post-Columbian years, the Caribbean was a Spanish lake. There was no challenge. In that time, among the things that happened were the introduction of slavery, the introduction of the plantation as a form of agricultural organization, and the introduction of sugar. The Spaniards pioneered these things in the Caribbean, and then they were picked up, carried forward by the British, the French, the Dutch, later the Danes, and many others. And what it has meant in Caribbean history is really that slavery is the bulking, unavoidable, inescapable feature of its agriculture, was in large measure for centuries to follow. I think one has to start with that note because it's, as I say, inescapable. It's very important to mention. Of course, it was not experienced that way evenly. These places varied greatly in this story. And the plantation itself, as a form of organization, its presence also varied in time and place from one of these societies to another. But I think that one has to begin noticing that, being aware of that, because slavery was such an important feature. Just as it was, and in some ways remains, an important feature of our studies of the American South or our studies of Brazil. And this, as far as I'm concerned, really defines Afro-America. those three places, with the Caribbean as pioneering and first. Though Spain did bring those three things, the plantation, slavery, and sugar, to the Caribbean, it's important to notice that the societies that really turned slavery into an industrial system were her North European rivals, the French, the British, the Dutch, the Danes, and to some extent others, but those in particular. And I think that I used to feel that, not speaking about slavery, but I would say that I thought that the most important analytical device or dimension one could use in thinking about the Caribbean was black-white. And I have come to think now that the most important analytical dimension is, in fact, Hispanic, non-Hispanic. Now, at one time, the Caribbean was entirely Hispanic, but the places where one can still use that adjective, I think, are Cuba, which is the largest of the islands, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic, that is the eastern two-thirds of the island that used to be called Santo Domingo. Those three places are Hispanic. The language spoken by their people is Spanish. Lots of the cultural attributes are Spanish in character. So those are the islands that I would pose in contradistinction to the rest. Now the rest. I said that after 1625 it was Spain's North European rivals that took up the challenge that Spain put down, because Spain was not, before 1762, a serious producer of sugar, rum, and molasses. When the North Europeans undertook their plantations, they all obviously took this much more seriously than Spain had, with lots of government support, with lots of support from their colonial offices. The reason that I have changed my perspective on understanding the region from a, if you will, racial or color difference or a slavery-free difference to a Hispanic, non-Hispanic difference is as follows. In all of the regions where the plantation took hold and remained important, there developed languages that were neither the language of the masters nor the language of the slave. And the significance of that, of those languages, is that they epitomize or represent the social gap between the slaves on the one hand and the masters on the other. Those languages were created as instruments of communication by the slaves themselves. And I think that difference, the difference between places that have Creole languages and places that do not, is symbolically very important. And more than just symbolically, but symbolically very important. It follows, and it's interesting to notice, the Creole languages developed in those societies that were not Hispanic and did not develop in those societies that were. What this means in practice is that in the Hispanic societies, there were already, at the time that the plantation became important and the number of slaves increased, there were already Spanish-speaking, non-white segments of population who could serve to Hispanicize or otherwise introduce newly arrived slaves into that society. So there's a real difference between what happened to slaves in, for instance, Puerto Rico and slaves in, for instance, Jamaica. That there was a form of social organization, of significantly different form of social organization in those two places, having to do with who spoke what. And I think it's curious that in the Cuban case, where after 1762, slavery did become enormously important, and the number of slaves introduced was unprecedented. I think there were years, in case of Cuba, where there were 30,000 a year introduced. That's 30,000 sorry. Yes, 30,000 a year. So in a decade, there would be 300,000 new slaves. So it was enormous introduction. But even in those places, you don't get Creoles. Because by then, there was such a large non-white Spanish-speaking population that Creoles didn't develop. There was no need for them. It was a very interesting kind of case where language, where a linguistic feature exposes to view a social difference. That said, I think that the composition of those Hispanic societies, even though profoundly broken up, bothered, disorganized by the introduction of such a large number of Africans in the period after 1762, in those three cases, what one had was a kind of cultural continuity that was not possible in a Jamaica or in a Saint-Domingue. What happened in Puerto Rico, slaves were introduced beginning in large numbers around 1815, but lasting only about 60 years. The whole system was gone by 1875, and what replaced it was labor conditions that were anything but good. But this system, as a system, lasted a very short time. No indication that any kind of a creolization of language occurred in the case of Puerto Rico. There was no population that spoke a different language.
Well, let me try to just push you a little bit on this.
Sure.
That one of the things that I think is distinctive about your work is that you've had a sustained reflection over many years on certain themes: rural proletarian, slave, peasantry, the plantation, sugar, but you've never chosen one of them as the key to Caribbean history, and you've always looked at the relations among them over time and the ways they combine with one another and the variations among them. So it seems, in one way, if I understand what you're saying, the language is in a sense, is in effect, perhaps. And would you look for causes in the different historical timing of the Spanish and non-Spanish Caribbean, that in the Spanish Caribbean, one kind of peasantry had a chance to form in a way that it didn't in the non-Spanish Caribbean, and then the plantation came quite late to the Spanish Caribbean, and that might explain some of the differences, but also I think highlights the utility of the way you think about the Caribbean, that we can see the variations and how they interact with one another, interrelate at different times.
Yeah, of course, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that I have tried to do what you're suggesting. It seemed to me, as I've worked over this material often through the years, that what I've wanted to do was to make, and here I'm thinking about the work of a European historian, Jan Gross, who talks about thinking circularly, revisiting a number of themes repeatedly, and making, as he says, I think, successive approximations of reality, so that people end up not so much with conclusions about wie es eigentlich gewesen war, how it truly happened, not with a firm sense of that, but with a better sense of what the context was for these particular forces, how they worked in relationship to each other. And it's certainly true, because in the Caribbean region you have 55 different islands, and many of them were quite bypassed by these forces, in large measure bypassed because they were too mountainous or too saline or lacked water. For various conditions, the whole thing of plantations and slavery and sugar couldn't work. And so there are many places like that. There are others where the system, for reasons having to do with wars among imperialist powers, started later than in others. So that what we're talking about is a multiplicity of islands with different histories through time. And these forces have a way of crisscrossing. We know that some of the islands in the Caribbean changed hands 14 times. So that, yes, I think that all of these things in play have to be seen in different combinations in different places. The Hispanic islands, after 1625, never received from the crown the kind of organized support for a sugar industry that the Dutch or the Danes or the British or the French were able to manage in their cases. And I think that this meant that Spain would be laggard. But as it turned out, by the middle of the 18th century, the Spaniards had become quite interested in sugar. And that was the height of the sugar industry, but it was only 50 years before Haiti became an independent country. So there are a number of different things going on in different places. And in the Hispanic islands, it had been possible, I think, because of successive small introductions of slaves and their subsequent emancipations in period of economic contraction, that you were able to build up large populations of intermediate ancestry who were Spanish-speaking. And when slavery became important in Cuba, by that time there were many, many such people who could mediate between the slaves on the one hand and the majority society on the other. And you know, the question's been raised for me by Stefan Palmier. He says in a letter, well, maybe there was some kind of creolization in the case of the slaves in Cuba, even though it was late. And indeed there may have been, but there was no Creole language.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I've drawn a distinction, and it's, you know, you can't legislate definitions, but I've used creolization to describe what happened in the British, the Danish, the Dutch, and the French islands, and not in the case of the Hispanic islands. Mm-hmm. So my feeling about it is that where the society was able to maintain or construct a certain coherence, then in those cases, it turns out they were Hispanic.
Maman voyait un peu de café, oh, on arrive moins souvent à la moindre chose à m'arrêter.
Well, maybe we can end our conversation by coming back to this idea of revisiting the same theme.
Yeah.
And that I think, you know, I could think about the body of your work, as I said before, as this continuous reflection on the same set of themes. And it might then be interesting for you to reflect a bit on the two really classic books you've written, The Worker and the Cane and Sugar and Power, and how they fit into the model of continuous reflecting and deepening our understanding of these things and subduing.
Sweetness and power. I was keep broadening that. I had a student, a former student of mine who's now at the University of Chicago and retired many years ago, wrote me a kind note when Sweetness and Power appeared, saying that he'd just read it and he'd been reflecting on how I'd written such a different book when I wrote Worker and the Cane. And I answered him gratefully, I thanked him for his compliments, and said that in fact I thought of those two books as really the same book. It's like looking through different ends of a binoculars, of a telescope. While recording Tasso's life, while he talked about his experience in pretty much in chronological fashion, not entirely, but pretty much in as if it were continuous history, I realized in the course of his telling me what had happened to him, that he had lived through the Puerto Rican experience of being made over again into a plantation society.
Mm-hmm.
And that when he talked as a child of holding a lantern while the paleros dig the ditches for the new irrigation system they were putting in, he talked about being 8 or 9 years old and standing up to his thighs in muddy water while they dug those ditches, holding a lantern over his head so that the man could see where he was digging. And then going through his experience of learning how to be a palero from the common law husband of his older sister, and going right up into his own life as a palero and as a sugarcane worker. One could see parallels with the way Puerto Rico itself was turned back into that kind of society, proletarianizing people with company stores and vales to buy in company stores, this fake money that they produced, and the way, the hours that they worked, seeing that what I had thought of as the history of Puerto Rico was paralleled by the history of this man. And so I was privileged to be able to see that first through the words of a person, that the experience became personal and real for me in a way that it was not when one reads its history. But that experience had a lot to do in ways that I didn't at first understand in writing Sweetness and Power. I had been learning about sugar for all of those years, and yet the experience that was most immediate and dramatic for me was knowing him. And when I wrote Sweetness and Power, some reviews of the book have been critical because I don't say enough about the Caribbean. And of course that's because I figure I've said it so many other places, I didn't want to write it again. But that is one of the things that's not left out, but it's partly missing. But certainly his influence on me isn't missing. And one reason I could write that book, which professes to be, or pretends to be, theoretical in its larger ambition, was because of those personal experiences I'd had at the beginning. So I really do think in some ways that it's like the first book turned the other way, or if you turned it inside out, it would be Tasso's story. They are connected. But the theme that you start with, Dale, I think is really very important. En fin de compte, when one looks at all of it and comes to some kinds of conclusions, what I was trying to do was to make the concept of culture as we anthropologists stand it relevant to a historical materialist view of humanity on Earth. I wanted it, and I think it's silly or banal to say I wanted to humanize dialectical materialism. What I wanted to do was make people who write history realize that history is made by men with their hands, and that that's where it begins, and that we can't leave that out when we build theory. But that's really, I guess, what I wanted to do with my anthropology. And I think there are other people who understand this and are doing it more now, and that's good. I think I'm very impressed by the work that Rebecca Scott has done in Cuba with these people she's studying, and I think that she's introduced other dimensions such as law, which are, I think, important to have in there. But I think that it's true. Anthropologists and historians have a lot to do with each other, and I'm working on a paper now that I may not finish for a long while, but in it I kind of argue that anthropology is the badly brought up child of history. Mm-hmm. And what makes its behavior naughty is that it challenges its parent to do better. Mm-hmm. And what makes its behavior accurate is that it realizes Western conception of world history is simply not adequate for our globe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a challenge you've left well for all of us. You can end there, so thank you.
Thank you.